Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, and thank you for watching IT Pro TV, helping you level up with IT learning everywhere you go. I'm Zach Memis, your host for this episode of CompTIA Linux Plus, graphical user interfaces. That's what we're going to be looking at now. And in fact, Don Pizzette is here to tell us all about it. Don, good to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Hey, looking forward to it, Zach. We're going to be diving into the world of graphical user interfaces, which, like the name implies, is the visual element of a Linux desktop that we work with. Now, I'm saying Linux desktop because a lot of times, if you're running a server, you skip the whole GUI altogether and you just go with a command line interface.
Right.
That's fine. But if you choose to go with a graphical interface, which is the default for most desktops, you've actually got a lot of choice and selection. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how those GUIs work. They actually all kind of work the same way. So we'll get a chance to learn what's going on behind the scenes, and then we'll talk about some of the different front ends that are available to create a pleasurable Linux experience. That's all coming up right here.
What are some of the things that GUI can help us with?
Well, you will hear some people say, like, I hate GUIs. I do everything from the command line. And those people are usually crazy. I remember, like, when I first started when I first started on the internet, my original account was a dial-up, and you'd get dropped to a shell, and so you did everything from the command line. I got used to that, and it made sense. In the days before mice, in the 1980s, 1970s, you just had command line, and that was it. And a lot of people got really proficient at it. You could be pretty quick, but man, is it a learning curve. It's an insanely steep learning curve to get in and actually work with a command line interface. So the main thing that a graphical user interface does for us is it makes it easy. It makes it where you could potentially stumble along and figure out how to do things without a manual, right? I feel confident that I could sit down on any operating system that has a GUI, and in at least, let's say you give me an hour. In an hour, I can figure out how to copy and paste files, or move a file from one folder to another file. I can do that if it's a GUI. If you drop me onto a command line, I've got to figure out, what's the command for copy? What's the command to make a directory? What's this? What's that? But in a GUI, things are simple. They're designed to be a little more human, right? Command line interface, that's made for the computer. That's to sort of let us talk the computer's language. The GUI lets the computer talk in our language, right? We have symbols and graphics that represent complex things on the back end. I don't need to know about a hard drive's mount point. If I just see a folder that says Don's Documents, that's great. That's where I'm going to put Don's Documents. That makes sense. That's the main thing. The other thing is it can make your system a little more accessible, right? The command line interface is not great for certain people. And with a graphical interface, there can be elements that are introduced, things like screen readers and other things that lay on top of that to be able to interpret the information and provide it back. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes there's accessibility problems with graphics. If there's pictures being shown and you have somebody who's visually impaired, the picture doesn't do them much good, right? With a command line, you don't have pictures. And so that's a case where a command line might be better. And in some cases, you're going to find that. But typically, the GUI is going to be the easier interface. Now, even though it's easier, there's other times where we might choose not to have it. And servers are the best example. On a server, we probably are concerned mostly about performance. I want the server to run as quickly as possible. Loading a GUI slows things down. It consumes resources. It consumes a little bit of RAM, a little bit of CPU. If you don't need that, you can remove it and just run on the CLI and be super efficient. On most desktops, though, we have more CPU and RAM than we know what to do with, and so it makes sense. You run the GUI, make life easier.
So what powers the GUI behind the scenes after we move the curtain away?
All right. So in the early days of Linux, right?
Yeah.
So going back to the early 1990s, it was command line only. Like Linus Torvalds wrote the kernel, and then they stuck the GNU toolkit on it, which is all command line. They got the bash shell running, and that's where you ended up in a terminal. And they decided it would be a good idea to have a graphical user interface. And what they started with back then, and is still used today, is a system that's called X Windows. And X Windows is it's actually built up of a couple of different pieces. Let me show you a diagram here. Here we go. So I've got this diagram, kind of shows how it works. On your operating system, you'll be running a service, and that service is called an X server, right? The X server is what's actually responsible for generating the graphics that you see. So it's the thing that's taking all this text stuff on the back end and converting it into graphics that then you're able to see, all right? Now, the X server does part of that. The X server really is handling the communication. There's another service called a compositor, And the compositor is what's actually generating the true graphics. So it's doing a lot of the work, but it doesn't know what work to do unless the X server tells it. So the X server is telling the compositor, hey, I need you to make these graphics. The compositor makes them and hands them back, right? Then the X server hands all that data that comes back to an X client. And an X client, that's the actual GUI that you see. That's the graphical implementation. It has to do a few different things. The X client, it goes by a few different names. You'll hear people refer to them as like a window manager, or you'll hear them called a desktop environment. And what that just means is the X server is giving them, here's the graphics for programs 1 through 5. Well, the window manager or the X client, it is to figure out, okay, where does the graphic for this program go? And we can move things around on our screen, right? So like here, if I go back to my CentOS box, okay, if I open up here, this program, well, an X server on the background registered that I clicked on that folder and I wanted to do something. And that's something that I wanted to do was to view my files. And the X server told the compositor, hey, can you render me a graphic of that folder? And here's the dimensions it needs to be. And then it handed that over to the X client. And my X client in this case is GNOME. And GNOME received it and said, okay, I'm going to put that right here. And then in GNOME, I can take it and I can move it over here, right? Now, the compositor is not really getting involved in this because it's already generated the graphic for the window. But I'm moving it around. The X client is what's doing that. Now, if I start resizing things, that's where things get a little bit different. Now the compositor does get involved because I'm changing the dimensions. And so it's got to reevaluate, recreate that graphic, and then the X client lays it on top. Now, to me as an end user, what do I see? I see a folder, right? And I see some files. I don't see that this multi-part system is running in the background and generating all this stuff. And it's actually pretty complex stuff. This X server, think about like a web server, right? A web server, if I sit down at the server and I run a web browser, I can see the web page, right? But I can also go to any computer in the world and fire up a web browser and view that web page also. The server is serving up that web page. Well, here the server is serving up our graphics files, right? And it can serve those up remotely, not just locally, right? On most operating systems like Microsoft Windows, your desktop is right there on the machine, and that's it. I can't see the desktop separate. Well, with X Windows, you can. You can fire up an X client on any machine and connect over the network, assuming it's not blocked by firewalls or things like that. You can connect up and you can see your desktop. You can just see it. It's all being rendered natively right there on your X client so that you see it, and it's like you're sitting at this other computer. It's really cool. With systems like Windows, they don't do that by default. You have to run extra software. In fact, you usually run something like RDP, the Remote Desktop Protocol. And Remote Desktop Protocol, what it's doing is the windows are being generated on the server. It's actually creating all the images and graphics, and then it's just sending a copy of those graphics to you. You see them. VNC, Virtual Network Computing, that's another protocol that does the same thing, that lets you remotely see a screen. But the screen's still being rendered on the other side. With X Windows, it's not like that. The graphical elements, they are being rendered on the server side. But then your X client is doing all the window positioning and things. And in that sense, if you're moving a window around on your screen, it'll actually perform better under an X client than it would under RDP or VNC. In fact, VNC is probably the slowest of the three. But those are all different ways to be able to see that screen. And it's kind of neat when you separate that out in your mind that I could be remote and yet still see the same screen as if I was sitting right in front of that computer, which is a pretty neat aspect. But these things all kind of stick together to create that environment. Now, I do want to mention one thing. I don't think it shows up on the exam, but in real life, X is very old. The X server was created a long, long time ago, and it doesn't do encryption between the service and the client. And that's because it kind of assumes they're running on the same machine. If you're running remote, you don't want to send an unencrypted copy of your desktop across the network. Somebody can intercept it and be able to view it. So we're normally going to combine that with what's called SSH tunneling. And that's where you create an encrypted tunnel between your client and the server, and then you build up your X session on top of that. That's a lot more complex. Most of the time, we're just running the graphics right there on our own machine, so we don't need encryption, because it's all staying right there local on the system. But all of these pieces are really being involved in just the basic process of rendering our desktop and getting it up on our screen. So that's kind of what's going on behind the scenes. We just don't see that when we log in as a human and see this screen.
So X is pretty important. Did Linus Torvalds create that as well?
He didn't, and this is a common misconception. When people say, like, Linus Torvalds created this entire distro, he really created the Linux kernel, the kernel that handles the boot process, the initial communicating with the hardware side of things. Everything else came from other projects like GNU, provided a lot of the command line utilities that we use. The graphics in this case also came from somewhere else. They came from the X project. X Windows was originally created by MIT back in, I think, 1984. It was like a long time ago. Linus Torvalds didn't create Linux until like 1991, 1992. So X Windows predates Linux, right? It actually was released for Unix-based operating systems and a few others that were predecessors to Linux. So when they decided they wanted to create a GUI for Linux, they didn't start from scratch. They didn't create something new. They went and they got something that already existed, and that was X Windows. Now, X Windows originally was controlled by MIT, and they eventually released it to the public, and its name changed. Let me bring up the website here. So originally it was just called X, and you would get X version 1.1 was the most common. So X11 was what you would run. Well, when they decided to release it to the public, it was basically forked into a new project name called X-Free86. So you hear some people say X11, you'll hear other people say X-Free86. They're really talking about the same thing. And what it is the X Windows server that's designed to run at the time on 386 machines. 386 were the Intel processors that were used in the late 80s, early 90s. So X-Free86 is supposed to be a play on that. This was released and open sourced, so anybody could port it to any distro or any other operating system if they wanted. There's even versions of X-Free86 that'll run on Microsoft Windows and Mac OS if you want. But there was a bit of a licensing kerfuffle or whatever after a few years, and so they the open source community didn't want to be beholden to a BSD license, and so they forked it again into a new project called X.org, which is controlled by the X.org Foundation. If you go to X.org, you'll find where they've got the entire environment. And you can see right here, the last full release of the entire X.org stack was X11R7. So they're still using that X11 terminology to show the roots of where this came from. But X.org is the actual X server that really every major distro is running these days. So that's where this stuff came from. Linus Torvalds didn't write it. It was a project that already existed. It just got ported over to Linux to be able to provide that. It has a very storied history. It goes back decades and even predates Linux. So a lot of work and a lot of human hours have gone into creating this GUI. But it also means that as you move between different operating systems, if I go to a BSD system or a true Unix system, they're usually running X Windows also. And so while it's a very different kernel under the hood, the GUI actually looks about the same. And you can move in between those OSs and operate pretty well. Remember, I said GUIs are all about making things easy? Well, it's even easier if the GUI is the same between different OSs. It's only when you go to like Mac OS or to Microsoft Windows where the GUI is significantly different. In the Unix and Linux world, they mostly do look the same, so you can move in between.
So you've already touched on this, but does every distribution use the X.org?
So I said every major one does, but it's actually not entirely true. Well, I guess it sort of is. Now I'm on the fence here. So,
yes and no. I love those answers.
So I mentioned that X is old, right? I mean, this is technology that was originally created in 1984 by volunteers, and it's slowly evolved over the years, but it still has a lot of weaknesses. Like, it still doesn't do encryption today. And here we are, like 30 years after its release, and it still doesn't have any encryption. It's known for not being very secure, right? Because it's intended to be run locally anyway, so it didn't worry too much about security. It's also known to not perform particularly well. And the main reason for that are all these different pieces that it's got. You know, going back to my diagram, we've got the X server and you've got the compositor, these two separate things, and then you've got the client on top of it. The more pieces you have, the more intercommunication you need. And that intercommunication was written according to a standard that was defined 30 years ago. So it's not very fast. And that's a drawback to X Windows. However, because you've got 30 years of development, most distros say, you know what, that's good enough for us, and we're going to stick with it. If you're running CentOS, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Ubuntu, Debian, if you're running any of those, you're using X.org, right? That's their default X server that's run in the background. But if you're running Fedora, you're not. Fedora is actually the first major distribution to trial running a new X server called Wayland. And it's running Wayland by default. Now, you can actually install Wayland on Ubuntu if you want. You can install Wayland on a few others. In fact, with Ubuntu 17, they were using Wayland as their default, and they switched back to X for Ubuntu 18. And it was because there were a few different problems. One of the main ones was this. screen mirroring or just remote screens works really well under X because it's been around so long. Under Wayland, it's super flaky, right?
Oh.
Wayland is not new. Wayland came out in 2008, 11 years ago, but that's way newer than X. So it hasn't had the same amount of review and tweaking and tuning. But the thing that Wayland does the best, it combines the role of the X server with the role of the compositor. It puts them together. So you don't have this intercommunication anymore. We don't have to send data between two different processes, which is slow. It's all done in one system. So it takes your input and your output. It takes all the commands that you're entering in. It generates the graphics and then renders them up to the client all in one stage. It's faster. If you're like a video gamer, then you'll appreciate Wayland because it will improve the way things render on the screen. But there's some trade-offs, and most of the trade-offs come from compatibility, right? There's a lot of things that were built around the way that X works, and on Wayland, they try to be compatible where they can, but some things get broken. But if you were to install Fedora right now, your UI might look the same as other distros, but it's actually using the Wayland compositor to be able to do all of its work. So you will encounter that just as you go around distros.
Well, switching to the client side, what are some of the predominant X clients out there?
All right, so the X client, that's what most people care about. Right? Most people, they don't care about whether they're running x.org or Wayland or whatever, because that's all behind the scenes. They want to think about their user interface, what they're seeing on the screen. So, for example, here I am. Let me minimize this window. Here I am on CentOS, right? And I see my CentOS desktop. And what I see is an applications menu up top where I can get to my various applications. That's exciting.
Yes, it's
I see a power button up here where I can get into my settings and adjust my calendar. I see folders on the desktop, and my running applications are rendered down here in this little bar, right? So I can switch between applications really easily. What I'm seeing right here is not my X server. I'm seeing a user interface called GNOME.
Yeah, I was going to say GNOME.
Yep. GNOME is the most common user interface, and I've got their webpage right here. So GNOME version 3 is the most common X client found on Linux systems. And not just Linux, even on BSD and even more like fringe operating systems. GNOME is just really, really popular. It's been around a long time. It's very mature. It's changed a lot over the years. If you ran GNOME version 1, it looks entirely different than the way GNOME version 3 does. In fact, GNOME version 2 was known for trying to mimic the Windows 95 interface to make it easier for Windows users to move over to Linux. And when they switched from GNOME version 2 to GNOME version 3, the UI changed so much that a lot of people didn't like that. They wanted to stay the old way. And so GNOME version 2 got forked into another desktop called Mate, this guy right here. And the Mate desktop, if you look at it, it actually looks very similar to GNOME version 3, the way they've got the screenshot. But there is like a start button at the bottom where you can kind of pull up a menu just like in the old Windows days. So some people really loved GNOME version 2, and you can still get active X clients that are built around that. But it's GNOME version 3 that's the most common. In fact, I'm running CentOS right here. So this is CentOS 7 with all the latest updates, and it's running GNOME version 3. I know that, like personally, I know that because I recognize the menus. If you see the menus enough, you know what they look like. Like in GNOME version 3, you've always got this power button up here where you can go and view your wired connection or wireless. You can turn the computer off or put it to sleep, lock your screen. That's an element that's created. If I go and let me just like right click on the desktop somewhere and choose an option. I'm going to go into my settings, and in my settings, you can go to details, and in the details, it actually shows that I'm running GNOME version 3.28.2, right? It doesn't tell me that I'm running x.org. It doesn't tell me that I'm running Wayland. It tells me my X client because that's what most people care about, right? Well, let me jump over to an Ubuntu machine. So this is Ubuntu 18.04, which is the most recent one as of the filming of this episode. And apparently I've left stuff running on it. And so here I am. And this desktop looks different, right? I don't have as many icons on my desktop, but those are just icons. I have a sidebar. I didn't have a sidebar under CentOS, right? This is an Ubuntu thing. Ubuntu was trying to be a little more compatible with tablets for a while, and so they started creating a sidebar in a whole different interface.
This is like the Atomic Beaver, isn't it, or something?
That's the distro, yeah. And Atomic Beaver was or Bionic Beaver. That's
Bionic Beaver. I keep messing that up.
Was the first one to move away from their Unity interface that they had before. Unity was replaced by GNOME. They've actually gone back to GNOME. It looks different, but I know this is GNOME. If I go up to the power button up top, see that menu looks pretty similar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We've got the wired managed network right there. I can go to my settings. I can power it off. I can lock the screen. That's a GNOME menu. It's easy to spot. But if I go into my desktop settings and pull up my details, I'll actually be able to see in here, just like on the other one, that this one is running GNOME. Actually, same version, 3.28.2. I didn't think it'd be the same, but it's the exact same version between the two. And that's because this is that most common interface. So if you have to learn one interface, GNOME is a great one to learn because it's going to be run by so many different distros. And as you move between machines, you're not having to reinvent the wheel. You kind of already know how you can navigate around. How do I lock the screen here? Well, it's actually done the same under Ubuntu and under CentOS because they're both running GNOME. So that's a nice part about it. The other nice thing about GNOME, the main reason why it's really the most successful one, accessibility. If you have people that use screen readers or Braille keyboards or any kind of tools that help with any kind of physical impairment, GNOME has great accessibility tools that are built into it. There are some really fancy X clients out there that do crazy like 3D desktops that can spin around and render things in super crazy lawnmower man style. And they're terrible for people that have any kind of impairment whatsoever. They just can't use them, right? And so that's a real problem. GNOME does a great job about being accessible, and that makes it perfect for universities, high schools, and even just general public, private sector. That's really why it's the most popular.
I love the lawnmower man reference, by the way. Who comes in second place for GUIs?
If you're not running GNOME, then the odds are you're running KDE. Okay, there's a few different GUIs that are out there, or X clients that are out there, but KDE is in second place. KDE is actually a really powerful UI. It has a number of crazy features to it. I think I've got their webpage pulled up around here somewhere. Let's see. Here we go. Plasma. So KDE is the actual organization behind it, but Plasma is what they call their desktop environment. And what it does is it's a very powerful modular desktop. Everything on the desktop is considered a module. You can edit it and change it. Do you want a sidebar? You can add one in. Do you want a dock at the bottom? You can add one in. Do you want a start button? You can add it in. Do you not want a start button? You can take it out, right? It's fully modular. And it also has a whole suite of utilities. Like they have their own web browser called Conqueror. They have their own editor. They have their own terminal. All these things, they all start with the letter K, so you can kind of spot them easy. And so it's very, very different, very powerful. And I would say that it's second place. You'll see where they mention Canonical, which is Ubuntu. They support or invest into KDE. Well, when you install Ubuntu, it does GNOME by default, right? But there are actually special distros of Ubuntu, like you can find Kubuntu, Kubuntu, that you can install, and it has KDE by default. SUSE uses KDE by default, SUSE Linux. So, there's different ones that are out there. This little screenshot here actually is the desktop. You kind of see there's a pseudo start menu down there at the bottom left, and they got some widgets on the desktop. It's just another powerful one, and it's probably in second place. People who like to tweak their desktop to make it look super fancy usually prefer KDE to GNOME because it gives you a lot more options.
Well, can we run KDE and GNOME on the same system?
You can, so I mentioned Kubuntu, right? Which is a whole different distro of Ubuntu. So you'd have to basically reinstall to have it. That's a pain. But you can add a second X client or 3, 4, 5. You can add as many X clients as you want to an install. You just have to know the package name. So for example, I'm running CentOS. CentOS defaults to GNOME. Well, before the show, I fired up a terminal and I ran this command right here, sudo yum group install. So instead of just a regular install, I'm installing an entire group. And I chose KDE Plasma Workspaces. All right. That tells CentOS to reach out to the repositories and grab the KDE environment. And the reason I had to do a group install is you'll see there's a ton attached. Look at all the packages here.
There's a few.
And I mean, it is a lot. And most of them are dependent. You've got to have them in order for it to work because all the packages I already had installed were designed for GNOME, not for KDE. So it's got to install these. But if you look at the list, where's the actual cleaner list? Here we go. Of what it's installing. Most of it is designed to make the graphical user interface work, but some of them are the special utilities that I mentioned. They have these dedicated ones that are just for it. And so you'll see them kind of in the mix here. Like Console with a K, that's their terminal program that's for the KDE environment. So it's installing that and a number of other things. Installing it, it's about, I think it was about 600 megabytes. So it's not giant, but once it's installed, I now have a second UI present, right? And I think it took maybe 10 minutes to download all the files and install them. Now, looking at my screen, I'm still in GNOME, right? But now that I have another user interface installed, I can log out And let me, whoops, I'm trying to click on my name there if I can. Darn it, there. I can log out. And when you have more than one X client installed, your login screen will actually give you the chance to change what environment you're going to boot to. So see how I've got my name here, and if I click on it, it's just going to let me log in, and that's it, right? It's going to default to GNOME. But before I do that, there's a little gear. And if I click on the gear, I can pick what UI I want to see. And if I've installed 5 different X clients, I would see all 5 here in the list. So I've got GNOME, and I was actually in GNOME Classic, not GNOME New. GNOME Classic tries to mirror the older configuration a little bit. The newer GNOME looks more like Ubuntu. Ubuntu defaults to the newer one that has the sidebar and all that. But I can also go into my KDE Plasma workspace. I'm going to choose that and punch in my password, which I think I typed wrong. Nope, got it right.
Yeah.
And now it's going to boot up, and it's going to load KDE. So it looks a lot different. I've got these icons that are appearing as K loads or KDE loads, and then it's going to drop me onto my desktop. And it got my resolution wrong, so let me fix that real quick. There we go. Ooh, it's going to go tiny. Oh, well, I'll survive. Okay, so so here we are. I'm now in my KDE desktop. Okay, right off the bat, I noticed that I've got no icons on my desktop. KDE goes for a very clean layout. And what I've got instead, and I'm going to have to zoom in because I made this entirely too small. Way down here at the bottom left, we have basically a start menu, kind of like what was under Windows 95 or earlier versions, but you can still do search and type and whatever to find your applications and run them. There's that Conquer web browser. See how it's spelled with a K? The special web browser that's just for them. And so I see those elements, and I can browse my applications right here, which I did from a top menu in GNOME, but here is built into a start menu at the bottom of my screen, which is a very traditional way of accessing this stuff for most users. They're used to having that start button down there. But it is all modular. I can add more things in. At the bottom right corner, if I zoom in on that, we'll see, oh, I guess my head's on it. There we go. We'll see a system tray, very much like Windows as well. You've got a clock and the various services that are running in the background. Under GNOME, this would be at the top right. Here, it's at the bottom right. Again, trying to make it easier for users to move over. But this is all designed to be super easy to use and customizable. So we can go in, and you'll notice I've got this lock widgets option, and that's saying that the desktop is locked right now. We could go in and add widgets, add panels. We can change things and configure and customize, but all just done right here. And so this is KDE, and at any point I can just log back out again. So if I can do it here, I'm going to choose to leave, and I'm going to log out. And when I log out, eventually, I can get back to my login screen, and then I can pick to log in again. And this time I can log in with whatever I want. I'm going to switch to GNOME New, not GNOME Classic. And I'll punch that one in, and we'll get logged in. I'll see that different X client. So you can switch in between. You do have to log out and log back in because you're in your client, right? But now I'm in GNOME New. Notice my icons are gone on the desktop, right? But I still have my activity menu, but when I click on the activity menu, I don't see an app list drop down. I see a sidebar and an app search, which is exactly what Ubuntu would be showing me. Let me switch back over to Ubuntu. And in here, if I click on activities, oh, shoot, I've got to open Windows. Let me get rid of that. We see basically a blank screen and that sidebar, and I can start to type for what I want. I want terminal. There it is. If I go back over to CentOS, I can click on that. I can type terminal, and again, same thing, right? Same operations, consistent user interface. So
fantastic.
I got off target, right? The original question was who's number 2? Number 2 is KDE, right? And so that's the other one. We kind of saw that briefly. Looks a little more old Windows style, but so customizable. If you do a search for KDE themes, you'll find where people do amazing things to make it look spectacular. KDE comes at a bit of a performance cost. It's a little bit more resource intensive than GNOME is. So that's another reason why GNOME is really the number 1.
Graphical user interface is another fantastic episode. Don, you did a great job as usual. And before we move on, anything else, sir?
There's probably some of you out there right now that are shouting because you love Cinnamon or Unity or whatever. There's a huge laundry list of other X clients that are out there. Personally, I use XFCE on my own machine, which I didn't mention here because it's not that popular. But there's LXDE. I mean, there's a ton. There's no right or wrong answer on these. You just try them all out. Usually there'll be some feature that's broken in one that makes me hate it, or some feature that works in another that's great. So, explore around a bit. Don't hesitate to install new X clients and try them out. And then if you don't like them, you can just uninstall them and move on with your life. It's pretty easy to do.
Excellent advice. And here's some more great advice. Make sure you watch every episode of CompTIA Linux Plus. You're going to be so glad you did. It's going to help you in those exams. And it's inevitable. They're coming. And by the way, don't stop studying. Keep studying. Take notes. Take advantage of the supplementary information in our course library. It'll do only one thing, help you be even more successful. So check that out as well. And tell everybody you know about IT Pro TV. IT Pro TV is binge-worthy. Thanks for watching. I'm Zach Memis.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
We will see you again soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.